Hi, everyone. I'm Kevin Delaney. I'm the editor-in-chief of Charter and the San Francisco Standard. Thanks for joining us for this webinar today. We're going to get started in just a moment. In the meantime, I'd encourage you, if you haven't already, to download the research playbook that we published. Charter has in partnership with Council Advisors, which is a leading C-suite advisory firm that works with CEOs and their teams to drive transformation and performance. And we've put out this new playbook called Leading in the Age of AI, Practices for the New Era, and we'll share a link with you for downloading that. Our discussion today is going to take that as a jumping off point, and we're lucky to have several of the folks who've been involved in that playbook and the research that we've done to be here for this discussion. As many of you know, Charter is a future of work media and research company. We're at charterworks.com, and AI and leadership is among the issues that we're focused on most squarely. The unique thing about this playbook, I think, is that we focused on how concretely leadership practices are changing and need to change as a result of AI. So there's a lot of discussion about this as something being in the future, but we've tried to be really practical and take the understanding of how AI is coming into organizations, what we know, what the best practices are, and translate that into actionable guidance for people in leadership positions for leading their teams and their organizations. So we're going to dive into the critical leadership strategies that every executive needs in this discussion. Over the next hour, I'm going to invite you all to in the chat. You can share feedback for the discussion, and there is a Q&A function in Zoom you're probably familiar with, and that if you put questions in there, we'll get to them through the course of the hour, and we'll leave some time, especially at the end, to focus on getting through those. So this session is going to focus on practical frameworks, real-world case studies, actionable tools that everyone can put to use. So without more introduction, I'm going to dive into the discussion and introduce the folks who are part of the session with me here today. First up, we have Taylor Griffin. She's managing partner at TMG, which is a leadership advisory firm focused on leadership development, and one of their specialty areas is succession planning. We have Ronald Heifetz, who's senior lecturer in public leadership at Harvard Kennedy School. And Ron is a father of the adaptive leadership framework, which we're going to talk about and is particularly relevant to the leadership challenges here. And then last but not least is David Niles. He's co-founder and CEO of Council Advisors, which I mentioned is a C-suite advisory firm that works with CEOs and their teams. So thank you, Taylor, David, and Ron for joining me here today for this discussion.
Thank you, Kevin.
I want to kick us off with just a broad sort of context setting for this. And what we know is that AI is accelerating decisions, compressing timelines, reshaping work, but leadership remains a human challenge, guiding people through uncertainty with clarity and purpose. So, Dave, I want to start with you maybe and ask you, is this time really different? Our premise is that things are changing for leaders, but I want to start with you. Is this time really different in terms of the changes to leadership necessitated by AI? Or are we seeing a replay of previous business and technology disruptions? We've had, for example, research from MIT recently that suggests that 95% of AI initiatives are failing to improve companies' business results. Does that in any way indicate that this is not different and that the anticipated impacts on leadership are overblown?
Sorry, great place to start, Kevin. And again, thanks for having us. Yeah, we're believers that this time it is indeed different. And that's not just because of the impressive size and scale, the $3 trillion that has already been committed to building data centers to support a lot of this AI processing. But fundamentally, the nature of AI and how AI can improve business. Because when you think about some of the past technology innovations, the internet coming into business or ERP, those, although they had broad impact, were pretty narrow in terms of how that impact translated through an organization. The internet impacted information creation and distribution. ERP really had a huge impact on supply chain and finance. AI fundamentally is different because as we've decomposed how work gets on an organization, AI affects so many different tasks, fundamental tasks in an organization. So it has the potential of actually influencing a much broader swath of the organization, but the impact is dispersed, right? So the problem set is different. And I think, as we read the MIT study, one, we weren't that surprised. A lot of the companies that we see have looked at AI and thought of it like past technology innovations and thought it was a silver bullet. So let's apply AI here and magic's going to happen. When in reality, the way you're going to extract value of AI is improving task by task activities. So the successful companies, and this was indicated in the MIT study, successful companies are deploying AI across workflows and really thinking about how AI can fundamentally transform how basic work gets done. That's a more complicated initiative than just putting a new technology system into a company or putting a new agent or application to work. So that's why we think it's different. Also, candidly, that's why we're so excited to be partnering with you on this study, because fundamentally, that kind of the nature of the AI opportunity and challenge is one that needs to be addressed by organizations. Reshaping how things get done in an organization across functions in how organizations operate has to come from the top. So it's uniquely a CEO challenge.
Great. And we're going to come back to that CEO challenge in a few minutes. Taylor, I want to ask you, I'm going to pull Ron in a second, but what is the state of leadership innovation across the business community? Are corporate boards and top teams truly rethinking leadership in light of AI, or is it something more surface level that they're focused on? I know you're working with a lot of these executives.
Yeah, so I think what you've got right now in terms of the current state, I think it's in a state of experimentation overall. So what you see is a lot of conviction amongst boards, amongst CEOs, amongst senior leaders in corporations, conviction around the potential and what it can offer to their organization, to other organizations. But I still think that there's probably a fair degree of uncertainty in terms of what this is going to mean with long-term innovation. So you've got, the pieces that are low-hanging fruit. You've got companies that are definitely touting, AI first right now. But the fundamentals for how they lead still really hasn't changed. I think everyone's trying to figure that out right now. And Donna Morris, I know, made a comment in the playbook around that. No one has quite figured it out. And I think I'm seeing a lot of that. You've got provocative statements, that leaders are making, right? Prove to me that AI can't do this job, and that is around workflows. And it's around just making sure that they are provoking their leaders to think about this differently. But it's still at a place of experimentation. And I think we're still relatively surface level given how new it is. And it obviously will be, rapidly evolving.
That's great. And that's exactly the context that we're trying to publish this playbook into to give people some specific measures. Ron, your adaptive leadership framework has guided governments and companies alike. How does it apply to the unique leadership demands of the AI era, do you think?
I think, to be completely honest, we're going to discover how over time. But so the best I can do is make some good guesses.
Go ahead.
I think the most common source of failure that I've seen in leadership in the 40 years of my career working with people around the world in different sectors is a diagnostic error. It's that they treat adaptive challenges as if they were technical problems. And sometimes enormous technological advances as AI make people think that this is a technical problem, but actually the discovery of what its application will need to be in myriad of environments, not only at the macro level in the C-suite of an organization, but distributed throughout an organization, because as David and Taylor began to suggest, you're going to need micro adaptations to micro environments. The application is going to take different forms in different hands, in different functions, different geographies, different services. throughout an organization and certainly throughout an industry or society. So this is a wonderful adaptive, challenge. But disaggregated, it really consists of thousands of micro challenges facing people in a distributed basis. A good analogy that comes from our shared recent history is the COVID-19 pandemic, which required local adaptations amongst 7 billion people around the world. Every family, every small business, every school teacher, every parish preacher or imam or rabbi had to figure out what was going to be their local adaptation to sustain people and reduce the death rate and help people's families, and so forth, and small businesses, small governments. Obviously, it was a leadership problem at the top of governments, but it was really, in part, the challenge at the top of government was to generate distributed leadership throughout the societies. And the ones who did it well were governments that had a lot of trust in amongst their citizens, and therefore were willing to take up the challenge rather than deny or resist the challenge. And you could see that their death rates were a lot lower. Even in countries with very independently minded people like Australia, or there was still a lot of trust in government. Didn't matter if it was a conservative or labor government. And that enabled then people to own the problem at the local level and generate widespread local adaptations that were required, because every family is different, and every schoolhouse is different, and every classroom is different, and every small business is different, and every larger business is different, and every municipality and neighborhood is different. So I don't know that this is a great analogy to AI, but at least to make the point that one of the key properties of a macro adaptive challenge or new adaptive environment that we're in is that one of the properties is that it demands a lot of local adaptations to local environments. And that requires a different mode of thinking about leadership that generates more leadership rather than generates dependency.
Ron, we're going to come back in a few minutes to tactics for leaders to actually have that kind of distributed leadership, because it's not necessarily the traditional playbook of leaders to give up, to be comfortable with distributed leadership. So in a few minutes, I want to come back to that. And I just want to note the distinction that you're making in your framework, without getting too much into detail of the framework, is between challenges that are technical, where we know the solution and the manager's job is to apply it, versus adaptive challenges like AI, where we don't necessarily know the endpoint or the solution that needs to be applied. So one of the things I want to shift for a minute to one of the areas that we focused on in the research playbook, which is the instinct of a lot of leaders is to use AI to optimize existing processes and make them more efficient. So that's a lot of the focus, for example, that MIT study that we're focused on. Taylor, I want to start with you. So your firm is advising senior executives, and what questions should they be asking themselves about the possibility that AI unblocks not just the efficiencies it provides in terms of resources, staffing, short-term performance?
I think there's a few things that they should be focused on. I mean, the first question, quite honestly, is, am I using it enough? Am I personally experimenting with it? Am I getting comfortable with the technology? It's not something that you just delegate to your strategy team to figure out, but like, you should have a sense of it and you should be playing with this technology. The other piece that I would say is, what becomes possible with this technology, instead of just looking at it as a productivity tool and we're going to be able to just, do more, what becomes actually something that we were never able to do that we can now do. And so we have this concept that we talk to a lot of leaders about called dynamic prioritization. You always have, your top 3 to 4 priorities, and those are the ones that you're most focused on, and you create focus within your organization around that. But you typically have a longer list of things that you would like to get to, but they move up and down based on circumstances and the context of the environment. You might be able to get to more of those. There might be more things that you thought you'd never get to within that you can revisit all of a sudden, and this makes this possible. And then I think that the third piece of this is that, how do I collapse all of this into what we call judgment and action? This is a tool that's going to provide you with so much information, so many insights, but the thing that it doesn't replace is human judgment. And so what you get paid for as a leader is actually your judgment and making sure that you're carving out time for that, and being able to create that differentiator with this tool becomes really important.
That's great. David, one of the things that we talk about in the playbook is the lump of task fallacy, which is sort of a complicated way to say that jobs are fixed bundles of tasks, and if AI is doing some of it, there are necessarily fewer tasks and fewer jobs. How should CEOs rethink roles in order to expand the opportunity for workers as AI does take on some more tasks?
Yeah, Kevin, the way we think about that is maybe to take a step back and kind of reflect on the nature of the impact of AI in business, and building off of, what Ron was, the thread that Ron was pulling on. Is AI something like, the advent of Python? Is AI the advent of Excel? Or is AI have the potential of being something bigger? And, in a lot of ways, not to overblow this, but in a lot of ways, this feels a little bit like electrification on the factory floor, right? Where when that first happened, we just put lights on so that the craftspeople could work longer hours. And it took a while, like a few decades, for people to figure out that electricity actually allows you to do things like assembly line manufacturing, totally rethink how fundamentally work is done. That's an aspiration that I think, the leading CEOs are really starting to get their head around. There are a couple great examples in the study that we all did together. Take ServiceNow, and a couple examples of where both in their sales department and in their IT departments, they were able to reconfigure work to allow kind of the more rote, lower value work to be done by agents. And that allows and frees up their team to do more higher value work. In the case of salespeople, more listening to customers and being out with customers. And in the case of IT, move from managing an IT function to being IT productivity consultants. I think that's a great way to kind of think about not only the augmentation of AI and helping you do your current work better, but also create more value. One of the things that we spend a lot of time with our clients talking about is that shift between kind of task-based management, task-based accountability, to more outcome-based accountability. And I think you start to get into that mind shift, it opens your eyes to, this isn't just an efficiency play. If done correctly, it can really help you reshape, the enterprise and how work is done.
And for that sort of expansive application of AI, some executives are actually feeling some pressure from shareholders and boards and others to show a more immediate ROI on it, to have the answers right away. Ron, how do you balance those pressures with the longer term vision required for expansive adoption if you're leading an organization?
I think Taylor and David touched on this. Innovation is an experimental process, and experiments usually fail. And it takes a lot of stamina, a lot of guts, and a lot of resources to stay in the game, to keep running iterations of an experiment until you finally get a robust innovation. I mean, think of the guts that it took Microsoft when it launched, with an enormous investment in engineering talent and marketing talent and branding, Windows 1.0. A lot of fanfare, and it flops. And so they go back to the drawing board. They pick themselves up and they do version 1.1 and it flops, and 1.2 and it flops, and 1.3. Then they make a big revision and, again, big trumpet fanfare, 2.0, and it flops. And that goes through its iterations, and finally they launch Windows 3.0 and it begins to succeed, and it begins to, they begin to, bring in a return on all of that investment. It takes a lot of stamina to stay in the game, because experiments generally fail. And that MIT study simply is pointing out that, yeah, most experiments fail. So it's the efficiency model is the right model when you're dealing with problems that are already within our know-how, technical problems where it's really a matter of increasing efficiency, in various ways. And some consulting firms are brilliant in figuring out how to generate greater efficiency. But this is about, at its heart, this is about massive, widespread, disseminated innovations. It's not a single innovation, it's multiple plays. So the CFO and the CEO in dealing with the investors, they have to buy themselves time. They have to be able to say to their investors, this could take 3 quarters, this could take 6 quarters. It may pay off soon, but it may not pay off. I mean, look how long it took for Amazon to be able to begin to generate any profitability. And so a lot of it, and it's investors understand that, even if you're a publicly traded company on a short leash, investors still understand that certain kinds of investments are going to take real time to pay off. So I think that it's very important in the same way that an emergency room doctor, you stabilize the patient, but then you want to buy yourself time to work the underlying problem. And so I think CEOs need to negotiate those timelines they're under, and they have to negotiate those pressures they're under, and they have to be willing to then give people a message that is mixed. It's both disappointing, I'm sorry, but we're not going to be able to promise you a return on investment. There is a huge level of uncertainty, and also hope that, listen, stay in the game with us, and it's going to pay off over time, but it's going to take a while for us to discover exactly what form that takes.
Ron, I find that advice really striking because so much of the conversation around technologies like AI is you have to move quickly, and it's the first movers and the people who, and actually this advice for leaders to buy themselves time to experiment and figure out their strategy for the longer term is interesting.
One of the risks of feeling under that pressure is that you feel like you have to make the big play. And betting the farm is, I think, usually a really dumb thing to do, unless your farm is the size of a garage. And then what the hell, you bet it, but if you've got a big farm, you want to have multiple plays going all at the same time, because you don't know which experiment is going to begin to generate a whole new form of profitability versus another at first. You don't know where the genius is going to come from. So like nature, you want to be running lots of experiments at the same time and hedging your risks. But you can't do that if you don't buy yourself time. And yeah. I've seen companies make the mistake of, under the pressure of producing results, they bet the farm, and once in a while they win, and a lot of times they just they destroy themselves.
I couldn't agree. Sorry to interrupt. I could not agree more with Ron. I think it's a brilliant point, and one that is not necessarily intuitive to people. And it's sort of how companies come up with a narrative around that does actually buy themselves time. So think about what Microsoft is doing right now. They're saying, we want to be customer one with all of our AI technology. It's actually buying them time in order to figure this out internally. And it's brilliant, right? It's a brilliant move. So sorry to interrupt. I just want to double down. That is a fantastic point.
That's great. I want to, we're starting to get some questions in. I just want to remind everyone who's attending today, encourage them to add questions in the Q&A or the chat, and we'll come to them through the discussion. And let's shift to the second area that we focused on in the playbook. And Ron, I'm going to stay with you for a minute because this is about leading adaptively through uncertainty. And one of the points that you made earlier is that leading adaptively requires a distributed model for leadership. And that, as I said, is not the traditional model where you have a strong CEO, you have a centralized leadership model, everything sort of cascades down to the organization. That's sort of a traditional approach to things. Can you explain what the key elements of a distributed leadership model look like and what some of the practices are that the people who are best at it are exhibiting?
Well, I'm proud that Microsoft and Google have been both drawing on this adaptive model over the last 20, 25 years, and Microsoft even has a vice president for adaptive leadership. So
Cool.
I think the lessons are out there, from these extraordinary companies. But there's a difference between leadership and authority. Every company needs an authority structure. Every family needs an authority structure. Kids can't have the same authority a parent has. There has to be a structure and a holding environment for the development of people, and authority structures provide that way of organizing, life from the family level all the way to the macro level of a, huge company or a government. But you also need leadership being practiced as a form of practice, not only from people in high positions of authority, but from people in middle positions of authority and even people all the way down in the front line. Because again, you just don't know where the interesting experiment and the idea is going to come from. It could be from some salesperson who has his or her ear closest to their ear closest to the front line and the marketplace, who begin to have the insight of, wait a second, we should be thinking this way, and who come up with the innovative idea. So the information has to flow up as well as down, so people in authority have a critical role in creating the holding environment. Or some people like the metaphor of a containing vessel that's going to hold all of this experimental processing and widespread innovation taking place, and help provide some coherence, coherence in messaging, coherence in investment, coherence in values, coherence in culture, coherence in general strategic direction. But not try to overspecify. So the job then would be to develop the leadership capacity in every reporting group, so that if you're the supervisor and you're supervising your direct reports, every meeting becomes an opportunity to be asking questions like, okay, tell me what experiment you've run. What have you learned from that failure? What's the next thing you're going to try? Where the conversations are supportive of experimentation and failure, not controlling conversations that make people frightened to reveal their failures or their mistakes. And efficiency control models tend to inhibit people from taking those risks and exposing those risks to the light of day, where they might, if they were exposed to the light of day, they might get some interesting input from their lateral and senior colleagues for what experiment to run next. So
Dave, can I pull you
want
in
that
on
to
that?
cascade. You want that to be modeled throughout the organization, so that you would be getting the encouragement of leadership all throughout the organization.
Dave, on that point, have you seen any practical ways that leaders have been able to build cultures where it's safe to do the things Ron's saying, to try, to fail, to learn with AI now?
No, 100%. And just building on that a little bit, I mean, this is like a little cute phrase we have, but, obviously these LLMs are, large language models. The cute phrase we use, they're large learning models, right? And so fundamentally, AI is a tool that benefits from what Ron just talked about, like constant experimentation, constant learning. So you need to have an organization that recognizes that, right, and responds to it and kind of creates a parallel structure. I mean, in terms of executive leadership skills and traits, I think more than ever, being clear about what the fundamentals of your enterprise are, and being clear about the goals that you're setting. How do you want to continue to deliver value to customers? What's your core business strategy? That's a key component of leaders who are bringing their organizations through this transformation successfully. I'd say the other piece of it, and Taylor touched a little bit on this, but rules-based environments with a lot of top-down command control. Obviously, that this is a challenging way for a challenging time for those kinds of organizations to learn. So we find CEOs that create more principles-based, environments where people understand where we're trying to go as a company, and then kind of what are the general principles by which we're going to get there. That allows the experimentation that Ron's talking about actually happen. But look, that's a big change for a lot of organizations today, and there's a lot of muscle memory in institutional operating models and personal behaviors that you got to break down.
Taylor, to piggyback on what David just said, how do you coach leaders to make that shift?
Well, I think, you think about being sort of demonstrating everything that's like the ultimate growth mindset. As a leader, I think CEOs can do this, where you sort of look at it as going, there's no artificial ceiling here. I'm responsible for raising the bar. I can take a learn it all versus know it all mindset as it relates to, what's in front of us. I can also take a nothing is too hard mindset, which means I'm going to champion like hard and inconvenient things. And I think when leaders do that, especially, it really sets a tone for an organization around what's possible and how they should be thinking about things.
That's great. And we have in the playbook, I think there's Bijal Shah, who's at Guild, who basically is like just having conversations, learning, using using the tools herself, and doing exactly what you said. We're going to move in a moment to one of the other areas we focus on, which is just leading through uncertainty and the communication. But one of the things, Ron, that you've talked about is the importance, what leaders actually need themselves in these moments, and the demands that this leading through uncertainty put on leaders, and how they can maintain their own resilience in prolonged periods of uncertainty, and model that for their teams. What are the key tactics for leaders to basically equip themselves for the sort of things that we're talking about?
I think Taylor and David could comment on this as well, because they've coached and worked with a lot of people intimately, as have I. So I would say that there are, first of all, it really helps to be a person who has a lot of curiosity and is really interested in discovery, to be in this space as a CEO, or at the or in any high position of authority in this era. Because if you have a lot of curiosity and you're adventuresome, then you know that you're gonna, all of a sudden encounter this misadventure and that misadventure, and over time that becomes all part of the adventure. But I think it's important to know that ultimately you're a critical part of the structure that generates the holding environment. You're backstopping a lot of the pressures, the anxieties, the uncertainties, the conflicts. There will be conflicts over strategy, over direction, over which innovation is better, over what to invest in. Lots of conflicts. And you, as the CEO, you have to hold everybody. You have to hold everybody, and you have to keep giving people confidence, even though in truth, you can't know for certain how it's going to play out. But you still have to give people confidence that they're going to make it. We're going to figure this out. And to manage your own fear and your own anxiety as you're conducting thousands of volts of electricity of everybody else's anxiety, and fear and conflict. So if you're busy holding everybody else, who's holding you? And you got to be held too, because by nature, by our biological nature, we evolved over millions of years to operate beautifully in small communities of 10 to 20 people. And only since the advent of agriculture 10,000 years ago did people start to live in larger communities where we could store food and develop cities and organizations. So we're still operating with the hardware of hunters and gatherers, beautifully equipped for providing the holding environment when there's just a small group of people in a stable ecosystem. But to conduct this kind of electricity and these kinds of uncertainties and these kinds of pressures requires a lot of ancillary aids or a lot of software capacity. And at a human level, then I break them down into three categories. I think that each of us needs a place where we're getting held so that we can then go back out into the office and hold everybody else. Who's holding us? So we need confidants, not just allies, who share our point of view, but who also have a stake in the situation. We need allies, and allies can be very good friends, but they often have also competing loyalties. So we need confidants who are often outside the system, where all they have to care about is us. They don't really care about the issues. They have no stake in the issues. So we need confidants who can pull us back up to what I call the balcony, to get off the dance floor, the playing field, so we can think straight again. And second, then I think we need sanctuaries. I'm not peddling any particular kind. It could be a place where you pray in community, but it could be a friend's kitchen table where you have tea. It could be a bar where you have your favorite drink. It could be the gym. It could be a room in your house where you meditate, or a park where you sit on a bench. But we each need physical locations, I think, where we can stop the noise, and when we can where it can get quiet again. And the third category is, I think we all need regular practices. Frequently under stress, we consider these practices luxuries, like I don't have time. But these practices are really critical, again, I think, to keeping ourselves straight. I remember once spending some time with the president of the World Bank, Jim Wolfenson, who was a great banker in his era. And Jim and I both play the cello. And Jim had, I once, spent a lot of time with play a little cello, play a little Bach. And he needed that. We need sanctuaries and practices. And the practices, again, it could be going to the gym or sports, or it could be writing poetry or playing music. It could be anything, For me, one of my regular practices when my kids were young, were taking them to school and picking them up every day.
Mhm.
That was a regular practice. It pulled me out of my work life and put me in a different world of meaning. So generally, I work with people to help them strengthen their commitment to all three of those: sanctuaries, confidants, and regular practices.
That's great. And I just want to pull in a comment from one of the attendees, Pam Asen, who just responded to what you said by saying there's something very poignant that so many of these strategies are around preserving / sustaining our own humanity in the context of this uncertainty and this change. David,
I just wanted, thank you.
Yeah.
I actually wanted to build on one, Ron, when thank you for that. I was taking some notes there. Great advice. You started by talking about using the word curiosity and talking about the importance of curiosity. And I think that's a concept that I want to make sure we touch on in this conversation, because to either lead or participate in this kind of transformation, intellectual curiosity is kind of one of the key components, and it's something we kind of talk about, but I think the organizations of the future are going to need to build that as kind of a leader in how you demonstrate and model intellectual curiosity. But then also as a leader, like, how do you build intellectual curiosity into the fabric of your business, and understand that, like, intellectual curiosity, yes, some people are born with it, but it's also a skill that can be learned. And we've seen great executives who are able to build that level of curiosity in their organization. And I think for all the reasons Taylor and Ron have been talking about today, like, that's particularly critical today.
That's really interesting that intellectual curiosity is a skill that can be learned. Can it be taught?
Yes, yes. No, I
Okay.
mean, not, but yeah, 100%. I mean, there are
Yeah.
ways, obviously, there are ways that you can lead people
Yeah.
to, different questions. And, Ron's points about creating, the right environment, you can create the right environment to allow people to experiment and
Yeah.
give them the kind of security they need to explore different ideas.
I think you can teach it. I mean, because every child, I've never seen a child that isn't curious.
Yeah.
It's biological to be curious. It's in the nature to be curious. That's how a child explores and learns. So it's really recovering the curiosity that's in
That's a
every
good way to put it.
all
Yeah,
of us,
yeah.
Yeah.
that gets squelched because you're not supposed to ask that question, or you're going to embarrass yourself, or you're going to embarrass us if you ask that question, or be quiet, or curiosity killed the cat. We even have stories that squelch the curiosity, the natural curiosity of human beings. So I agree
Yeah.
with David that recovering of it is possible.
And the foundation
And
of all of it is questions, right? Socratic leadership, forcing yourself to just ask questions. If you start there, it's a great place.
Yeah.
Taylor, can I ask you, we're going to go to the questions that are the folks who have joined us today have been sharing and encourage folks. Well, we should have time for a few more and we'll go through the ones that are there already. But Ron was referring to this, the volts of anxiety that are coursing through organizations as adaptive change and uncertainty sort of come through them. And one question I wanted to ask you is, have you seen any particularly successful, effective strategies for communicating and both acknowledging the uncertainty, but not undermining employee confidence in a moment like this?
Yeah, I mean, I think if I was to explain it in a really simple and straightforward way, where CEOs are really effective at this is I think they do a good job of defining reality and offering hope. And Ron made an earlier point around, you've got to create the parameters for this, but also make sure that you're optimistic about, we're going to be able to tackle this. And so there's an element of just acknowledging that there is a level of uncertainty with that we're exploring, that we're experimenting, what we're committed to, what are some of those, to Dave's point, the principles that we're committed to as a company, as leaders, and then what's the hope that they can extend out there to give their employees confidence that they're going to treat this, evolving technology in the right way.
That's great. Why don't I'm going to pull in a few questions now. And Ron, I will just share one of the comments with you from Irada Sadikova, who said in the chat that adaptive leadership has done wonders for us at Microsoft. So your work has had an impact there. Pam Eason had a question to start us off. What are some ways we can measure success within this long-term framework for the possibilities of AI? How do we know if we're successful?
Well, I'll dive in, and my partners in crime will have, I'm sure, better ideas. To Taylor's point, setting up the strategy and communication of a lot of these experiments, I think, is super important. So being really clear about what is that future state that we're trying to drive, what is that big ambition, I think is helpful in terms of like setting out, what the measuring stick's going to be, and then measure the experiments. And the experiments, again, not to be cute about it, these are large learning models, right? Quote unquote. And so like every experiment we do is getting us closer to that long-term ambition. We've worked with some great CEOs who have, even in public company settings, gone to their investor base and said, this is how we think at a headline level, we can reshape how work gets done in our company and how our industry operates. Now we're going to go on a course of experimentation over the next, and it's going to be a few years where we're going to like make progress. And that progress may be, we tried a big idea and it didn't work, or maybe we tried a big idea and we actually, made some real improvements. But I think setting like that really high standard of what your ambition is and being clear about it, and then being very clear about like, we're experimenting here and, some stuff's going to work, some stuff's not going to work. And, either way we're learning, and either way we're getting closer to the truth.
I think to that point, just to build on that, Dave, I think we would be doing the wrong thing if we're trying to set like really specific metrics and targets against something that we're already saying is an unknown, and is super ambiguous right now. So you're probably looking at things around, what are our high level goals? And then within that, like, what are our adoption rates inside of the organization? How many people are actually using this technology? If we're starting to look at just, elements of like an ROI, which, as we all know, and you referenced earlier from an MIT perspective, that's just too soon to tell. So I think kind of keeping an experimental mindset is also really important in this.
Ron, do you have anything to add on this question of how you know if you're successful at in this time navigating this uncertainty?
You probably try to generate a proxy measurement for how many interesting experiments seem to be moving forward, and are you and improving your ability to close down experiments that seem not to be worth the additional investment. I would look at process measures like that. I mean, ultimately, you need outcomes. You need new profitability, new cost effectiveness, and so forth. So, new revenue. But in the immediate term, we have to find process indicators that there's, that we're firing on more cylinders rather than less, and that some of those firings are generating interesting ideas to run with.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, yes.
We have a related question from Eric Bruce. When you have to make a business case for funding or resources, how do you both quantify the value when it's still largely unknown and then track progress? Professor Ethan Mollick has talked about being careful not to be too driven by metrics in the experimental phase. How do you navigate these nuances? And I think what you just said may be the answer to this, which is quantifying the experiments that you're running and the starting to and looking for the outcomes from that. Is that how you'd answer that?
Yeah.
Okay.
That's how I would think about it.
And I might build a little bit on that. I think there has been a tendency, because there's a lot of experimentation that needs to go on here, to put that experimentation in the fringes of a business. So, hey, let's go see if we can, help reinvent, employee benefits and, some of the more, kind of supportive functions. And those are interesting experiments. I would encourage people to think about how these tools can help reshape the core of a business, because then the experiments really matter. It's one thing to say, we think we can save, a couple FTEs in having an automated, benefits agent. That's interesting. What's more interesting in my mind is, how are we using these tools to experiment, creating something that is radically different than where we are? A business that's growing faster, a business that's radically more efficient, a business that serves our customers a lot better. Those kinds of experience in the heart of a business, I think, enable people to, get the support of a leadership team or a board to actually make some significant investments.
We have a few questions where folks are asking for examples of companies that are best in class right now for navigating this. So Erin Wayne and Esther Debraseni, have you seen any companies that are leading the way in articulating AI strategy or have done a good job acknowledging the uncertainty this bring, best in class examples for mastering the leadership challenge and how they did it? Is there anybody who comes to mind that you can talk about? I know all of your work is confidential. I can suggest that folks read the research playbook, where we do actually talk about specific companies, including,
I think there's some great examples in there.
ServiceNow and Guild and some other companies in there who are probably pretty good examples of what folks are asking about.
I think that's right. Salesforce has been doing some interesting work. I mean, Benioff just announced a big shift in how they're thinking about kind of customer service and sales resources, which I think is pretty interesting, at least as a headline. One place I'd encourage you is the insurance company AIG, where we have a longstanding relationship. Their spring investor day, they did a really compelling job of explaining how AI can impact the insurance industry, what experiments they're running, and kind of where they are in the process. And it was that mix of big aspirational goal with some very concrete near-term experiments. Not a ton of promises made, but it was a really, I thought, fantastic way of framing all the work they're doing. So I'd point to that.
Great. Andrew Gillespie has a question. With the efficiency gains brought by AI, many are raising concerns about pricing pressure, particularly for professional services firms that have traditionally billed based on time. To offset, do you see AI accelerating a shift from time-based billing to value-based billing? For example, we align price to the value, impact, and or business ROI of our work versus the time we spend on the task.
That's a great question. So Taylor and I run professional services firms, so we're struggling with the exact same question. So thank you for asking it. I mean, for our business and for the businesses we advise, it's too early to tell whether this is going to be, a set of tools that's going to help us deliver more value for our clients and customers, and or is it going to be a tool for us to do our work efficiently? I think until you figure that out, how this actually translates through into margins and things like that, it's too early.
Great. Okay. This question I think is for you, Ron. It's Nathan Pritz, and he said he's in higher education. I wonder how the panelists might think about how this cycle of experimentation, iteration translates to a skill or group of skills that tomorrow's leaders need. And I imagine that's a question you're thinking about with your students, especially.
I mean, the whole point of schooling is to help people learn how to learn, and not just take in a lot of information and memorize it, but to learn how to learn so that they are enormously adaptive throughout their lifetime to whatever context they're going to be in, social or political or business, organizational or cultural, whatever context they happen to land in, that they can land on their feet and figure out how to learn about the environment and and manage their own learning process. So, the iterative process the gentleman was just referring to, I think it was a gentleman, I could be wrong, excuse me if I'm
Yeah,
not.
it is.
That's part of knowing how to learn, is that you try something out, and it doesn't quite work, and you try it again. You make the wrong turn on the road, and you figure out how to drive around the block differently. So so in schooling, the challenge remains a very real challenge of how to teach students K through 12 as well as at university or graduate school where I work, to learn how to learn, not simply how to pass a test.
Yeah.
And or collect information, and that's still a challenge in the educational system, because it's a hell of a lot harder to teach kids as well as grown-ups, how to stay in the game of learning when the older you get, the more embarrassing it is to fail, and the more proud you become of your competence, and the more difficult it is to get people to go beyond their frontier of competence into the zone of their incompetence, where they can be learning again and exploring again, experimenting and failing, but also pushing that frontier of competence outwards. So as people get older, getting people to cross that frontier of competence often requires encouragement. I tell a lot of people in organizational life, businesses, as well as governments and nonprofits, that part of their job as authority figures is to bless the incompetence, is to make it permissible, for people to move beyond their frontier of competence where they're learning again. And it's not hard to do that with 6-year-olds, but it's harder to do that with 12-year-olds, and it's even harder to do that with 20-year-olds.
Yeah.
So, or 30-year-olds. So, for good reason, we're all very proud of our competence, and we work really hard to develop these competencies. but AI, like as a major adaptive opportunity, is challenging all of us to go beyond our current frontier of competence and to flounder
Yeah.
and to not
Well,
get too frightened of floundering.
and what some educators say is that AI gets in the way of learning sometimes because it can provide an easy answer and sort of
Well,
shortcut.
that's true. I mean,
Yeah.
GPS, people don't learn how to read a map anymore
Yeah.
or think visually about a physical space. So we have to help people figure out how to use AI well and not have it degrade their own capacity for critical thinking.
So we're just about out of time, and I want to just give the three of you an opportunity to share your last advice for folks who've been listening today, kind of what they should take away and go out and do. And we just have a minute or less for each of you just to share that. David, do you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. I mean, and if there is a message here from my perspective, there's a sense of optimism about what these tools can do. Yes, it's going to be a bumpy road, but if you think of the analogy of electrification on a factory floor, there's just an enormous opportunity for both businesses and individuals. I was hosting a session with a bunch of our young leaders a couple of days ago. I think this is one of the most exciting times to be a 25-year-old in business. There's a lot to learn and there's going to be a lot of change out there, but I think the shape of how things are done in the next decade or two is going to change radically. And that's a really exciting place to be.
Great. Taylor, what about you? What's your parting advice?
Yeah, I would say just the fundamentals of leadership still really apply, whether you're managing a team of people, a team of agents, a combined team in the future. I mean, the principles of leadership are still there. And so that means communication, trust, transparency, absorption of stress around you. What you know about leadership still actually really matters.
Great. Ron.
I guess I'd like to just focus on the people who feel at risk for losing their jobs. I would say some of you, first of all, try to enjoy the adventure of the creativity and the discovery, but there will be casualties and some people will lose their jobs. And I want people, when they are at that transition, to try to somehow recover the plasticity they had as teenage kids, when there were a lot of different ways to make a life and a lot of different ways to make meaning and a lot of different ways to even make a living. To somehow recover that sense that, or faith in themselves, that it feels personal, but it's not really personal, that it's not an indictment on their capacity to generate new a new way of life for themselves and for their families. And it's hard sometimes to maintain faith.
Yeah.
That would be my
Yeah.
prayer for everyone.
That's great. Thank you. And among the things I'm taking away from this discussion are sort of enriching, sort of protecting yourself, creating a space for yourself, blessing the incompetence of others to allow them, which is not a traditional instinct of a lot of leaders. Blessing the incompetence is the last thing that their probably instincts tell them to do. So I want to thank everyone for joining us today. Encourage folks to download the playbook. There's Ron and David both appear in the playbook, and there's a lot more frameworks and structures in there for people to put to work. And as I said at the outset, that our goal, at Charter in partnership with Council Advisors on this work has been to really explore and provide practices for the new era that are based in best practices and research. And before we go, I just want to thank David Niles, who's the co-founder and CEO of Council Advisors, who's been our partner on this. They're a C-suite advisory firm. Taylor Griffin, she's the managing partner at TMG, which is a leadership advisory firm. And Ron Heifetz from Harvard, who is one of the parents of adaptive leadership. And thank you, the three of you, for this really excellent discussion. And thanks everyone else for joining us and engaging in so deeply in the topic. So have a good day, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Kevin.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you very much.